The humid Charleston air hung thick as molasses on that sweltering July evening in 1901, when Pastor Elias Whitcomb stepped onto the weathered wooden steps of the First Baptist Church of Charleston. The gas lamps flickered against the gathering dusk, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the congregation that had assembled in the churchyard. Word had spread through the cobblestone streets like wildfire. The pastor had something extraordinary to announce. Elias was a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. His black coat, despite the oppressive heat, remained buttoned to his throat, and his graying beard was meticulously groomed. He had served this community for nearly 2 decades, earning respect through his passionate sermons and unwavering dedication to the Lord's work. But tonight, something different emanated from him, an electric energy that made the crowd lean forward in anticipation. "Brothers and sisters," his voice boomed across the yard, carrying easily over the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of horse-drawn carriages on the main thoroughfare. "I stand before you tonight as a humble servant, blessed beyond measure by the Almighty's grace." The congregation murmured among themselves. Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the mayor's wife, fanned herself vigorously while whispering to her companion. Young Thomas Fletcher, the blacksmith's apprentice, craned his neck to get a better view. Even old Samuel Hartwell, who rarely attended services due to his arthritis, had made the journey to hear what the pastor had to say. "The Lord," Elias continued, his voice rising with each word, "has seen fit to bestow upon my household a gift so profound, so miraculous, that I can barely comprehend its magnitude." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the crowd like a heavy blanket. "My daughters Clara and Miriam have been touched by divine grace." A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Clara, 17, and Miriam, 15, were well known in Charleston's tight-knit community. Clara was admired for her beauty and gentle nature, often seen helping the elderly with their shopping or reading to the children after Sunday service. Miriam, though younger, possessed an intelligence that impressed even the most educated men in town. Both girls were considered paragons of Christian virtue. 3 nights ago, Elias's voice dropped to a reverent whisper that somehow carried to every ear. As my daughters knelt in prayer before retiring, they were visited by an angel of the Lord. This celestial being spoke to them in tongues unknown to mortal men, blessing them with the power to heal the sick and comfort the afflicted. Dr. Benjamin Morrison, the town's physician, shifted uncomfortably in the crowd. He was a man of science, educated at Harvard Medical School, and such claims made him deeply uneasy. Yet he remained silent, unwilling to challenge the pastor publicly without evidence. "Tomorrow evening," Elias announced, his arms spreading wide as if to embrace the entire congregation, "I invite you all to witness the Lord's work through my blessed daughters. Come and see the power of faith made manifest. Come and be healed." And as the crowd began to disperse, excited chatter filling the night air, few noticed the subtle changes that had already begun to take hold. The gas lamps seemed to flicker more erratically than usual, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. A faint, sweet smell, like flowers left too long in water, lingered in the air around the church. And if anyone had looked closely at the pastor's house, they might have seen 2 pale figures standing motionless at an upstairs window, their eyes reflecting the lamplight with an unnatural gleam. Inside the modest parsonage, Clara and Miriam Whitcomb sat in their shared bedroom, hands folded in their laps, staring at the wall with expressions of serene emptiness. They had not spoken since their father's announcement, had barely moved except to breathe. The only sound in the room was the soft whisper of wind through the curtains, wind that carried with it words in a language that predated human civilization, words that only they could hear and understand. The blessing had indeed come to the Whitcomb household, but blessings, as the people of Charleston would soon learn, often came with a price that was only revealed when it was far too late to refuse payment. The following evening brought with it an oppressive humidity that seemed to press down on Charleston like the weight of divine judgment. By 6 o'clock, a crowd of nearly 200 souls had gathered in and around the First Baptist Church, spilling out into the street and creating a sea of eager faces illuminated by the warm glow of gas lamps and lanterns. Pastor Whitcomb had arranged the church's interior to accommodate the unprecedented gathering. The wooden pews had been pushed against the walls, creating an open space in the center where his daughters could minister to those in need. Clara and Miriam stood near the altar, dressed in simple white cotton dresses that seemed to glow in the lamplight. Their hair was braided and pinned back severely, giving them an ethereal, almost otherworldly appearance. "Let us begin with prayer," Elias announced, his voice carrying easily through the packed church. The crowd fell silent, heads bowed, as he offered a lengthy invocation asking for God's blessing on the evening's proceedings. When the prayer concluded, a nervous energy filled the air. People shifted restlessly, whispering among themselves, unsure of what to expect. It was then that Mrs. Catherine Brennan, a widow in her 60s who had been suffering from a painful limp for over a year, stepped forward with the help of her walking stick. "Pastor," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear, "my leg. The doctor says there's nothing more to be done. The pain keeps me awake at night, and I can barely manage my daily tasks." Clara moved forward with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. Her movements were fluid, deliberate, as if she were following choreography known only to her. She approached Mrs. Brennan with a serene smile that never quite reached her eyes. "The Lord sees your suffering, sister," Clara said, her voice carrying a musical quality that hadn't been there before. "He wishes to ease your burden." She placed her hands on Mrs. Brennan's leg, just above the knee where the pain was most severe. The moment her palms made contact, a visible shudder ran through the older woman's body. Her eyes widened, and she gasped as if she had been struck by lightning. "I can feel it," Mrs. Brennan whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Something warm, moving through my leg like liquid fire." The crowd pressed closer, straining to see what was happening. Dr. Morrison pushed through the throng, his medical bag in hand, determined to observe whatever was taking place with a scientific eye. Clara's hands remained on Mrs. Brennan's leg for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity to those watching. When she finally stepped back, her face was pale but radiant, as if she had just completed some sacred ritual. "Walk, sister," Clara commanded softly. Mrs. Brennan hesitated for a moment, then tentatively put weight on her afflicted leg. Her eyes widened in amazement as she took a step, then another, without the aid of her walking stick. The pain that had plagued her for months was completely gone. "Praise the Lord," she cried out, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I'm healed. I'm truly healed." The church erupted in a mixture of gasps, prayers, and exclamations of wonder. Several people fell to their knees, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Others pushed forward, eager to be the next to receive this miraculous healing. Dr. Morrison approached Mrs. Brennan, his face a mask of professional skepticism. "May I examine your leg, Catherine?" he asked. She nodded enthusiastically, and the doctor conducted a thorough examination, testing her range of motion, checking for swelling, and asking detailed questions about her pain levels. After several minutes, he straightened up, his expression troubled. "I cannot explain it," he admitted to the crowd. "The inflammation that was clearly present in her knee joint appears to have completely subsided. By all medical understanding, this should not be possible." The crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch. More people pressed forward, each hoping to be touched by the divine grace that flowed through the Whitcomb daughters. Miriam, who had remained silent during Clara's healing, now stepped forward to address a young man named Peter Hawkins, who had been born with a withered arm. "Brother Peter," Miriam said, her voice carrying the same musical quality as her sister's. "Your faith has brought you here tonight. The Lord wishes to make you whole." As Miriam placed her hands on Peter's deformed limb, the same phenomenon occurred. The young man's body convulsed as if struck by electricity, and before the amazed eyes of the congregation, his withered arm began to fill out, the muscles strengthening and the bones straightening until it appeared completely normal. The crowd was now in a state of religious ecstasy. People wept, prayed, and sang hymns of praise. Pastor Whitcomb stood to one side, his face glowing with pride and religious fervor, believing himself to be witnessing the hand of God working through his daughters. But Dr. Morrison noticed something that the others, caught up in their religious euphoria, had missed. As each healing was performed, the Whitcomb sisters seemed to grow slightly paler, as if the act of healing was draining something vital from them. More disturbing still, he observed that their eyes, once warm and expressive, now held a distant, almost vacant quality, as if they were looking at something far beyond the physical world. As the evening wore on and more healings were performed, a subtle change began to settle over the church. The temperature seemed to drop despite the summer heat, and shadows appeared to move independently of their sources. The sweet, cloying smell that had been present the night before grew stronger, now tinged with something else, something that reminded Dr. Morrison uncomfortably of the scent of decay. By the time the service concluded near midnight, 17 people had been healed of various ailments. The crowd dispersed in a state of religious euphoria, spreading word of the miracle throughout Charleston. But as the last of the congregation filed out into the humid night air, none of them noticed that the gas lamps in the church had begun to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost like a code, or that the shadows cast by the altar cross had begun to bend and twist in ways that defied the laws of physics. In the parsonage next door, Clara and Miriam sat in their bedroom, staring at the wall with the same vacant expressions they had worn the night before. They had not spoken since the healing service ended, had not acknowledged their father's proud congratulations or their neighbor's grateful thanks. They simply sat, listening to whispers that came from somewhere beyond the veil of the physical world, whispers that spoke of prices to be paid and debts that would soon come due. The first miracle had been performed, and Charleston would never be the same. 3 days after the miraculous healing service, Charleston buzzed with an energy that bordered on hysteria. Word of the Whitcomb sisters' divine gifts had spread beyond the city limits, drawing pilgrims from as far away as Savannah and Columbia. The modest First Baptist Church could no longer accommodate the crowds, forcing Pastor Whitcomb to move the healing services to the town square. Dr. Morrison had spent those 3 days in a state of profound unease, conducting follow-up examinations on those who had been healed. What he discovered defied not only medical explanation, but seemed to violate the very laws of nature. Mrs. Brennan's knee showed no signs of the arthritis that had plagued her for years. The cartilage appeared to have regenerated completely. Peter Hawkins' arm was not only functional, but showed muscle development that should have taken months of physical therapy to achieve. Yet something else troubled the doctor deeply. Each person he examined displayed a subtle but unmistakable change in their demeanor. They spoke of their healing with the appropriate gratitude and wonder, but their eyes held a distant quality, as if part of their consciousness remained elsewhere. More disturbing still, several reported experiencing vivid dreams filled with imagery they couldn't quite remember upon waking, dreams that left them feeling both blessed and somehow diminished. On the 4th morning, Dr. Morrison's worst fears began to manifest. Mrs. Brennan arrived at his office before dawn, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "Doctor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "something's wrong. The pain in my leg is gone, praise the Lord, but I can't feel anything else either. It's as if that part of my body doesn't belong to me anymore." Morrison conducted a thorough examination and discovered that while Mrs. Brennan's leg was indeed healed, she had lost all sensation below the knee. More alarming still, the skin in that area had taken on a waxy, almost translucent quality, that reminded him uncomfortably of a corpse. "There's something else, Doctor," Mrs. Brennan continued, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders despite the morning heat. "I've been having dreams, terrible dreams. There's a voice that speaks to me in a language I don't understand, but somehow I know what it's saying. It tells me that the healing came with a price, and that price will be collected soon." Before Dr. Morrison could respond, young Peter Hawkins burst through the office door, his newly healed arm hanging limp at his side. His face was flushed with fever, and his eyes held a wild, desperate quality. "Doctor, you have to help me," he gasped. "My arm, it's not mine anymore. I can move it, but I can't feel it. And sometimes it moves on its own. Last night, I woke up to find it writing things in a language I've never seen before. When I tried to stop it, the hand wouldn't obey me." Morrison examined Peter's arm and found the same waxy, lifeless quality he had observed in Mrs. Brennan's leg. The muscle tone was perfect, the range of motion complete, but the limb felt cold to the touch and showed no response to pain stimuli. As the morning progressed, more of the healed began to arrive at Dr. Morrison's office, each reporting similar symptoms. The parts of their bodies that had been touched by the Whitcomb sisters' healing power were becoming increasingly numb and unresponsive, while their dreams grew more vivid and disturbing. Meanwhile, at the parsonage, Pastor Whitcomb was preparing for another healing service, oblivious to the growing crisis among his daughter's previous patients. Clara and Miriam had not left their room in 2 days, claiming they needed to pray and prepare for the Lord's work. When Elias knocked on their door to check on them, they responded in voices that seemed to harmonize in impossible ways, assuring him that all was well and that they were simply communing with the divine. What the pastor didn't know was that his daughters were no longer alone in that room. The entity that had first appeared to them as an angel had revealed its true nature, and the price for its gifts was becoming clear. Each healing they performed transferred a portion of the recipient's life force to the entity, while simultaneously binding that person to its will. The healed were becoming vessels, empty shells that could be filled with the entity's influence when the time was right. That evening, as another crowd gathered in the town square for the healing service, Dr. Morrison made a desperate decision. He approached Pastor Whitcomb privately, pulling him aside before the service could begin. "Elias, I need to speak with you about the healings," Morrison said, his voice urgent. "There are complications, serious complications that you need to know about." Pastor Whitcomb's eyes flashed with irritation. "Benjamin, I understand that as a man of science, this challenges your understanding of the natural world. But what my daughters are doing is the work of the Lord. I will not have you spreading doubt among the faithful." "This isn't about faith or science," Morrison insisted. "The people who have been healed are experiencing severe side effects. They're losing sensation in the healed areas, and their behavior is changing. Something is very wrong here." Before Pastor Whitcomb could respond, a commotion erupted in the crowd. Mrs. Brennan had collapsed in the town square, her body convulsing violently. As Dr. Morrison rushed to her aid, he noticed that her eyes had rolled back, showing only the whites, and she was speaking in the same unknown language that several other patients had mentioned in their dreams. The crowd pressed closer, some interpreting her convulsions as a sign of divine possession, others backing away in fear. But Morrison noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Mrs. Brennan was not alone in her affliction. Throughout the crowd, others who had been healed in previous services were beginning to show similar symptoms. Their eyes were rolling back, their bodies swaying in unison, and from their lips came the same alien words in perfect synchronization. As the possessed began to move through the crowd with jerky, unnatural movements, panic started to spread among the onlookers. Some fled in terror, while others fell to their knees in prayer, believing they were witnessing some form of divine revelation. At the center of it all, Clara and Miriam Whitcomb stood motionless, their white dresses billowing in a wind that seemed to affect only them. Their eyes were now completely black, reflecting no light, and when they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "The harvest begins," they said in unison, their words carrying across the square with supernatural clarity. "Those who have received grace must now give grace in return. The vessel must be filled, and the ancient hunger must be fed." Dr. Morrison realized with growing horror that the healings had never been miracles at all. They had been a form of spiritual infection, preparing the recipients to serve as conduits for something ancient and malevolent. The entity that had appeared to the Whitcomb sisters had been patient, building its influence slowly, but now it was ready to claim its due. As chaos erupted in the town square and the possessed began to converge on the remaining crowd with predatory intent, Morrison understood that Charleston was facing something far worse than a crisis of faith. They were confronting an evil that had used their deepest beliefs against them, turning their hope for divine intervention into a gateway for damnation. The price of grace was about to be collected in full, and the currency would be measured in souls. The morning after the horrific events in the town square brought an eerie silence to Charleston. The streets, usually bustling with activity by dawn, remained largely empty, save for the occasional figure hurrying past with their head down and their pace quickened. Word of what had transpired spread through whispered conversations behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Dr. Morrison had spent the night at his office, treating those who had been injured in the panic that followed the mass possession. 17 people had been trampled in the chaos, and 3 remained missing, including Mrs. Brennan, who had vanished along with the other possessed individuals when the crowd finally dispersed. The doctor's hands shook as he cleaned and bandaged wounds, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. At the parsonage, Pastor Whitcomb sat in his study, staring at the Bible open before him, but seeing none of the words. His world had crumbled in the span of a few hours, and he found himself questioning everything he had believed about his daughter's gifts. The memory of their black eyes and inhuman voices haunted him, but a part of him still clung to the hope that there was some divine explanation for what had occurred. A soft knock at his door interrupted his troubled thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse from the previous night's shouting. To his surprise, Clara entered the room, looking exactly as she had before the first healing service. Her eyes clear and blue, her expression gentle and concerned. She wore a simple blue dress instead of the white gown from the night before, and her hair was arranged in the modest style she had always favored. "Father," she said, her voice carrying none of the supernatural harmonics that had terrified the crowd. "I wanted to speak with you about what happened last night." Elias studied his daughter's face carefully, searching for any sign of the otherworldly presence that had seemed to possess her. "Clara, my dear child, what has happened to you and your sister? What was that thing that spoke through you?" Clara moved closer, settling into the chair across from his desk, with the same graceful movements she had always possessed. "Father, I need you to understand something important. What you witnessed last night was not evil, it was a test of faith. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes his methods can appear frightening to those who lack understanding." "A test?" Elias's voice cracked with emotion. "Clara, people were hurt. Mrs. Brennan and the others, and they disappeared. Their families are beside themselves with worry. They have been called to serve a higher purpose," Clara replied, her tone remaining calm and reassuring. "Just as Miriam and I have been called, the Lord has chosen us to be vessels for his will, and sometimes that requires sacrifice." Dr. Morrison, who had been making his way to the parsonage to confront the pastor about his daughters, paused outside the study window when he heard voices within. What he observed through the gap in the curtains made his blood run cold. Clara appeared completely normal, but her shadow on the wall behind her moved independently, writhing and shifting in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Where is Miriam?" Pastor Whitcomb asked, his voice heavy with dread. "She is preparing for the next phase of our ministry," Clara answered. "Tonight, we will complete the work that was begun. Those who have been blessed with healing will fulfill their purpose, and Charleston will become a beacon of divine power that will draw the faithful from across the nation." "Clara, please," Elias pleaded, reaching across the desk to take his daughter's hand. "This isn't the Lord's work. I can feel it in my soul. There's something dark here, something that's using you and your sister for its own purposes." The moment his fingers touched Clara's hand, Pastor Whitcomb gasped and jerked back as if he had been burned. Her skin was ice cold, and for just an instant he had felt something else, a presence vast and hungry that regarded him with ancient malevolence. Clara's expression didn't change, but her voice took on a subtle edge. "Father, your faith is being tested. Do not fail the Lord, as so many others have. Accept his will, and you will be rewarded. Resist, and you will share the fate of those who oppose divine purpose." Outside the window, Dr. Morrison had heard enough. He crept away from the parsonage and made his way quickly through the empty streets to the home of Judge Marcus Caldwell, one of the few prominent citizens who had not attended the healing services. If anyone in Charleston had the authority and influence to organize resistance to whatever was happening, it would be the judge. Judge Caldwell, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating grey eyes, listened to Dr. Morrison's account with growing alarm. As a man of law and reason, he had always been skeptical of religious extremism, but what the doctor described went far beyond mere fanaticism. "You're telling me that these healing services have been some form of spiritual infection?" the judge asked, pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey despite the early hour. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Morrison replied. "The people who were healed have been changed, transformed into something else, and now they've disappeared along with the Whitcomb sisters. I believe they're planning something for tonight, something that will affect the entire town." Judge Caldwell was quiet for a long moment, staring out his window at the unnaturally quiet streets. "What do you propose we do? We can't exactly arrest someone for performing miracles, even if those miracles have complications. We need to find where they've taken the missing people," Morrison said, "and we need to warn the townspeople to stay in their homes tonight. Whatever the Whitcomb sisters are planning, I don't think it will be limited to those who attended the healing services." As if summoned by their conversation, a low, harmonious humming began to drift through the air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Both men moved to the window and looked out to see a sight that defied explanation. The missing townspeople were walking through the streets in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like dancers following unheard music. Mrs. Brennan led the procession, her face serene, but her eyes completely black. Behind her came Peter Hawkins and the others who had been healed, all moving with the same eerie coordination. But it was what followed the possessed that truly terrified the two observers. Shadows moved independently of their sources, flowing along the ground like liquid darkness. The very air seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly energy, and the temperature began to drop despite the summer heat. "Dear God," Judge Caldwell whispered, "what have we allowed into our town?" The procession moved toward the town square, where a crowd was already beginning to gather. Not the eager, hopeful crowd that had attended the healing services, but a mass of people who moved with the same synchronized precision as the possessed. Dr. Morrison realized with growing horror that the influence was spreading, affecting even those who had never been directly touched by the Whitcomb sisters' power. "It's too late," he said, his voice barely audible. "Whatever they're planning, it's already begun. The entire town is falling under their influence." As the sun began to set over Charleston, casting long shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose, The two men watched helplessly as their community transformed before their eyes. The entity that had first appeared to Clara and Miriam Wickham was finally ready to reveal its true nature and claim the harvest it had so patiently cultivated. The blessing that had come to Charleston was about to show its true face, and that face was one of ancient hunger and endless darkness. As darkness fell over Charleston, the town square transformed into something that belonged more in a nightmare than in the heart of a God-fearing community. The possessed townspeople had arranged themselves in concentric circles around a makeshift altar constructed from the church's wooden pews. At the center stood Clara and Miriam Wickham, no longer bothering to maintain their human facades. Their skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed dark veins pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Their eyes were pools of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When they moved, it was with a fluid grace that defied human anatomy, as if their bones had been replaced with something more flexible and alien. Dr. Morrison and Judge Caldwell had managed to gather a small group of unaffected townspeople in the judge's house, those who had been away during the healing services or had possessed enough natural resistance to avoid the spreading influence. Among them were Sheriff William Hayes, the town's telegraph operator Samuel Reed, and a handful of others who watched in horror through the windows as their neighbors and loved ones participated in the unholy ceremony. "We have to do something," Sheriff Hayes said, his hand resting on his service revolver. "I can't just stand here and watch while those things use our people like puppets." "What exactly do you propose?" Judge Caldwell asked grimly. "Those are our friends and family members out there. Even if they're under some form of influence, I won't authorize violence against innocent people." Dr. Morrison pressed his face closer to the window, trying to make sense of what he was observing. "Look at the pattern they're forming," he said. "It's not random. They're creating some kind of symbol or diagram with their bodies." Indeed, the possessed townspeople had arranged themselves in an intricate geometric pattern that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As they swayed in unison, their movements traced complex designs in the air, and the very atmosphere around the square began to shimmer and distort. At the center of it all, Clara and Miriam began to speak in voices that harmonized in impossible ways, their words carrying across the square with supernatural clarity despite the distance. The language they used was ancient beyond human memory, predating civilization itself, and yet somehow the meaning was clear to all who heard it. They were calling something forth from the spaces between worlds, offering the life force of the possessed as payment for its manifestation. The entity that had first appeared to them as an angel was finally ready to shed all pretense and reveal its true nature. Pastor Whitcomb, who had been among the last to succumb to the influence, stood at the edge of the inner circle. His face bore an expression of profound anguish, as if some part of his consciousness remained aware of what was happening but was powerless to resist. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he watched his daughters serve as conduits for an evil that had used his faith against him. "The vessel is prepared," Clara and Miriam spoke in unison, their voices now carrying harmonics that made the windows of nearby buildings vibrate. "The harvest is complete. Let the ancient hunger be satisfied, and let the new age begin." The air above the square began to tear like fabric, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible beyond. Tendrils of living shadow poured through the growing rift, reaching down to caress the upturned faces of the possessed. Where the shadows touched, the townspeople began to change, their humanity draining away like water from a broken vessel. "My God," whispered Samuel Reed, the telegraph operator. "We have to warn the outside world. If this thing fully manifests, it won't stop with Charleston." He rushed to his equipment and began frantically tapping out messages to neighboring towns and cities, describing the supernatural crisis that was unfolding. But even as he worked, he could feel the influence pressing against his mind, whispering promises of peace and purpose if he would only surrender his will. Back in the square, the ritual was reaching its climax. The possessed townspeople had begun to collapse one by one, their life force completely drained to fuel the entity's manifestation. Mrs. Brennan was among the first to fall, her body crumbling to dust as the last of her essence was consumed. Peter Hawkins followed moments later, his newly healed arm dissolving into shadow before the rest of him followed suit. But their sacrifice was not in vain, at least not from the entity's perspective. With each death, the rift above the square grew larger, and more of the creature's true form became visible. It was something that the human mind could barely comprehend, a writhing mass of darkness and hunger that existed in dimensions beyond the physical world. Clara and Miriam, their purpose nearly fulfilled, began to show signs of the same dissolution that had claimed their victims. Their translucent skin started to crack and flake away, revealing the hollow shells they had become, yet they continued to chant, their voices growing weaker but never faltering in their devotion to the entity they served. Dr. Morrison realized with growing desperation that conventional weapons would be useless against such a creature. But as he watched the horror unfold, he remembered something from his medical training, a lecture about the power of the human will to overcome even the most dire circumstances. "The possessed," he said suddenly, turning to the others. "They're not completely gone. I saw the anguish in Pastor Whitcomb's face. Part of them is still fighting the influence." "What are you suggesting?" Judge Caldwell asked. "If we can reach them, remind them of who they were before this started, we might be able to break the entity's hold. It's feeding on their life force, but it needs their willing participation to complete the manifestation." Sheriff Hayes nodded grimly. "It's worth a try, but how do we get close enough without being affected ourselves?" Dr. Morrison was already moving toward the door. "We don't have a choice. If we don't act now, there won't be anything left of Charleston to save." The small group of survivors prepared to venture into the nightmare that their town had become, knowing that they were likely walking to their deaths, but unable to stand by while an ancient evil consumed everything they held dear. The battle for Charleston's soul was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of their community, but potentially the future of the world itself. As they stepped out into the shadow-filled streets, the entity's laughter echoed across the square, a sound like breaking glass and dying stars that promised suffering beyond imagination for any who dared to oppose its will. The streets of Charleston had become a labyrinth of living shadows as Dr. Morrison led the small band of survivors toward the town square. The very air seemed thick with malevolent energy, and each step forward required tremendous effort, as if they were walking through invisible molasses. The entity's influence pressed against their minds like a physical weight, whispering promises of peace if they would only surrender their will. Sheriff Hayes stumbled and nearly fell as a tendril of shadow wrapped around his ankle. "Doctor," he gasped, "I don't think we're going to make it. The thing's too strong." Morrison helped the sheriff to his feet, his own vision blurring as the entity's whispers grew louder in his mind. "We have to try. Look at what's happening to the square." The rift above the town center had grown enormous, and through it they could see glimpses of the entity's true realm, a place of endless hunger and despair where consumed souls writhed in eternal torment. The creature itself was now partially manifested, its massive form casting impossible shadows that moved independently of any light source. But it was the sight of Pastor Whitcomb that gave Morrison hope. The man stood at the edge of the inner circle, his body swaying with the others, but his face contorted in an expression of desperate resistance. Tears continued to stream down his cheeks, and his lips moved in what appeared to be silent prayer. "Elias," Morrison shouted, his voice barely carrying over the otherworldly chanting. "Fight it! Remember who you are!" The pastor's head turned slightly at the sound of his name, and for a moment his eyes cleared. The entity's influence wavered, and several of the possessed stumbled in their synchronized movements. Clara and Miriam, now little more than hollow shells channeling the creature's power, turned their black eyes toward the approaching survivors. When they spoke, their voices carried the full weight of the entity's rage. "You cannot stop what has already begun," they said in unison. "The harvest is nearly complete. Soon this vessel will be strong enough to spread across your world like a plague, consuming all in its path." But even as they spoke, cracks began to appear in their facade. The sisters' forms flickered between their corrupted state and glimpses of the innocent girls they had once been. Morrison realized that some part of them was still fighting, still trying to break free from the entity's control. "Clara! Miriam!" he called out, pushing forward despite the shadows that clawed at him. "Remember your father's love. Remember the real faith you once held." Judge Caldwell and the others spread out, each calling to different members of the possessed crowd, trying to reach whatever humanity remained within them. Samuel Reed shouted to his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, reminding her of the apple pies she used to bake for church socials. Sheriff Hayes called out to young Tommy Fletcher, recounting memories of teaching the boy to fish at the creek behind the church. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The synchronized movements of the possessed began to falter as individual memories fought against the entity's control. The creature's manifestation wavered, its form becoming less solid as its power source was disrupted. Pastor Whitcomb was the first to break free completely. With a cry of anguish and determination, he threw off the entity's influence and stumbled toward his daughters. "Clara, Miriam, come back to me. You are my children, not vessels for this abomination." The entity's rage was palpable as it realized its carefully laid plans were unraveling. Through Clara and Miriam, it spoke with a voice like grinding stone. "You understand nothing, mortal. Your daughters came to me willingly. They sought power, and I gave it to them. The price was always their souls." But Pastor Whitcomb pressed forward, his faith, real faith, not the corrupted version the entity had exploited, burning bright within him. "No," he said firmly. "They were children, deceived by your lies. You appeared to them as an angel, twisted their innocent desire to help others into something dark. But love is stronger than deception, and I will not abandon my daughters to you." He reached out and grasped Clara's hand, ignoring the searing cold that burned his flesh. The moment their skin touched, memories flooded through the connection. Clara as a baby, taking her first steps. Clara reading to the younger children after Sunday service. Clara comforting him after her mother's death, promising that they would always be a family. Clara's black eyes flickered, and for an instant they returned to their natural blue. "Father?" she whispered, her voice small and confused, like a child waking from a nightmare. The entity shrieked in fury as its hold on Clara began to slip. It poured more of its power through Miriam, trying to maintain the ritual, but the younger sister was also beginning to remember. The sight of her father's love for Clara awakened her own memories, playing in the garden behind the parsonage, learning to read from the family Bible, the warmth of her father's embrace when thunderstorms frightened her. "Miriam!" Clara called out, her voice growing stronger as more of her humanity returned. "Remember who we are. Remember what we truly believed before this thing corrupted our faith." The two sisters reached for each other across the circle, their touch breaking the geometric pattern that had been channeling the entity's power. The possessed townspeople began to collapse, but instead of crumbling to dust, they fell into natural sleep as the creature's influence was severed. The entity, realizing that its manifestation was failing, made one final desperate attempt to complete its work. It poured all of its remaining power into the rift above the square, trying to force its way fully into the physical world before its anchors were completely lost. The air itself seemed to scream as reality bent and twisted around the creature's efforts. Buildings groaned and cracked, windows shattered, and the very ground beneath their feet began to buckle and heave. Dr. Morrison understood that they had only moments before the entity's death throes destroyed the entire town. "Everyone needs to get clear," he shouted. "The whole square is going to collapse." But Clara and Miriam, their humanity restored but their bodies still serving as conduits for the entity's power, knew what had to be done. They looked at each other with the same understanding that had always existed between them as sisters, and then turned to their father with expressions of infinite love and terrible resolve. "Father," Clara said, her voice clear and strong despite the chaos around them, "we have to close the rift. The only way to stop it is from this side, and we're the only ones connected strongly enough to do it." "No," Pastor Whitcomb said, understanding immediately what they meant. "There has to be another way. I won't lose you both." "You're not losing us," Miriam said, taking his hand. "We'll always be with you, in your heart and in your faith. But this is our responsibility. We opened the door, and we have to close it." The sisters joined hands and began to pray, not in the alien tongue the entity had taught them, but in the simple, heartfelt words they had learned at their father's knee. As they prayed, their bodies began to glow with a warm, golden light that was the antithesis of the entity's cold darkness. The creature fought against them, pouring its malevolence through their connection, but their combined will, strengthened by love, sacrifice, and genuine faith, proved stronger than its ancient hunger. The rift began to contract, and the entity's partially manifested form was pulled back toward its own realm. "I will return," the creature promised as it was dragged away. "This world will know my hunger again." "Perhaps," Clara said, her form beginning to fade as the golden light consumed her. "But not today, and not through us." The rift snapped shut with a sound like thunder, and the unnatural shadows that had plagued Charleston vanished instantly. Clara and Miriam Whitcomb disappeared with the light, their sacrifice sealing the breach between worlds and banishing the entity back to the darkness from whence it came. Pastor Whitcomb fell to his knees in the suddenly quiet square, surrounded by his unconscious but breathing neighbors. The possessed had been freed, their memories of the ordeal already beginning to fade like a half-remembered nightmare. The town would recover, the buildings would be rebuilt, and life would go on. But Elias Whitcomb would carry the memory of his daughter's sacrifice for the rest of his days, not as a burden of grief, but as a testament to the power of love and genuine faith to overcome even the darkest evil. In the years that followed, he would speak often of the difference between true faith and the corruption that masquerades as divine will, ensuring that Charleston would never again fall prey to such deception. The horrific blessing that had come to the Whitcomb household was ended, but the real blessing, the love between a father and his daughters and their willingness to sacrifice everything to protect others, would endure forever. In the end, it was not divine power that saved Charleston, but the very human capacity for love, sacrifice, and redemption. As dawn broke over the town, Dr. Morrison helped Pastor Whitcomb to his feet, and together they began the long work of healing their community, not through supernatural means, but through the patient, difficult, and ultimately more powerful process of human compassion and genuine care for one another. The shadows were gone, and Charleston was free. 6 months after the events that would come to be known as the Charleston Incident, in hushed conversations and carefully worded newspaper reports, life in the small South Carolina town had settled into a new rhythm. The official story, as recorded by the authorities and reported in the Charleston Mercury, spoke of a tragic outbreak of mass hysteria brought on by the summer heat and religious fervor, a phenomenon not uncommon in the rural South of 1901. Dr. Benjamin Morrison had been instrumental in crafting this narrative, understanding that the truth would either be dismissed as madness or, worse, attract the attention of those who might seek to replicate what the Whitcomb sisters had inadvertently unleashed. The missing time experienced by the possessed was attributed to heat stroke and temporary delirium, and most of the townspeople seemed content to accept this explanation, their memories of the supernatural events already fading like morning mist. The First Baptist Church of Charleston had been rebuilt on the same site, but Pastor Elias Whitcomb no longer stood at its pulpit. He had requested a transfer to a small mission church in the mountains of North Carolina, claiming that he needed time for reflection and spiritual renewal. The truth was that he could no longer bear to look upon the altar where his daughters had made their final sacrifice, or to see the faces of the townspeople who had been touched by the entity's influence. On this particular February morning, as snow dusted the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Pastor Whitcomb sat in his modest cabin, writing in the journal he had kept since leaving Charleston. His hair had gone completely white in the months since the incident, and deep lines etched his face, but his eyes held a clarity that had been absent during those dark summer days. February 15th, 1902. I dreamed of Clara and Miriam again last night. Not the hollow shells they became in those final days, but my daughters as they truly were, full of life and laughter, eager to serve the Lord and help their fellow man. In the dream, they were children again, chasing fireflies in the garden behind the parsonage while their mother called them in for supper. I have come to understand that the entity which corrupted them was drawn not by evil in their hearts, but by the very purity of their intentions. It fed on their desire to heal and help others, twisting that noble impulse into something dark and hungry. This knowledge brings me both comfort and caution. Comfort because I know my daughters were innocent victims, and caution because I now understand how easily good intentions can be perverted by forces beyond our comprehension. Dr. Morrison writes to me regularly, keeping me informed of Charleston's recovery. The townspeople who were possessed have shown no lasting effects, though several have reported dreams of a place of shadows and whispers. Mrs. Brennan's leg remains healed, though she claims it sometimes aches when storms approach, as if it remembers the unnatural touch that restored it. Young Peter Hawkins has become something of a local hero, using his restored arm to help rebuild the homes damaged during that terrible night. He speaks little of his experience, but Dr. Morrison tells me the young man has developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when others are in spiritual distress. Perhaps some gifts, once given, cannot be entirely taken away. Pastor Whitcomb paused in his writing, setting down his pen to stare out the window at the snow-covered landscape. In the distance he could see the small church where he now ministered to a congregation of mountain folk, simple people who asked little of their pastor beyond honest sermons and genuine care for their souls. A knock at his door interrupted his reverie. He opened it to find Sarah Mackenzie, a young woman from his congregation whose husband had been killed in a mining accident the previous month. Her eyes were red with recent tears, and she clutched a letter in her trembling hands. "Pastor Whitcomb," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I received word from the mining company. They're saying James's death was his own fault, that he was drinking on the job. They won't pay the compensation they promised, and I don't know how I'll feed my children." Elias invited her in, settling her by the fire with a cup of hot tea. As he listened to her story, he felt the familiar stirring of righteous anger at injustice, the same feeling that had once driven him to seek divine intervention for his community's problems. But now, he understood the difference between seeking God's help and demanding miraculous solutions. "Sarah," he said gently, "I cannot promise you miracles or easy answers, but I can promise you that you are not alone in this struggle. Tomorrow, I'll ride down to the mining office with you and we'll speak to them together. Sometimes the presence of a witness is enough to remind people of their Christian duty." "But what if they still refuse?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Then we'll find another way," Elias replied firmly. "We'll speak to the other families in the congregation, organize a collection to help you through the winter. We'll write letters to the newspapers, to the state authorities if necessary. The Lord helps those who help themselves, and sometimes his greatest miracles come through the hands and hearts of ordinary people working together." Sarah's face brightened slightly at his words, This was not the promise of supernatural intervention she might have hoped for, but it was something more valuable, the assurance of human solidarity and practical action. After she left, Pastor Whitcomb returned to his journal, his pen moving steadily across the page. I have learned that true faith is not about seeking signs and wonders, but about finding the strength to do what is right, even when the heavens seem silent. The entity that destroyed my daughters fed on our desire for easy answers to difficult problems, our wish to see God's hand moving visibly in the world. But God's hand is always moving, in the kindness of neighbors, in the courage of those who stand up for justice, in the love that binds families together, even in the face of tragedy. These are the real miracles, the ones that happen every day without fanfare or recognition. I failed my daughters by encouraging them to seek supernatural gifts instead of nurturing the natural compassion they already possessed. I will not make that mistake again. My ministry now is simpler, but perhaps more honest, to remind people that they already have everything they need to serve God and help their fellow man. The power to heal does not come from above, but from within, and it is measured not in dramatic cures, but in small acts of love and service. As evening fell over the mountains, Pastor Whitcomb closed his journal and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve his small congregation without the promise of miracles or supernatural intervention. It was harder work than what he had done in Charleston, but it was also more honest, more grounded in the reality of human struggle and human love. In Charleston, Dr. Morrison was conducting his evening rounds, checking on patients who suffered from ailments that could be treated with medicine and care rather than divine intervention. The town had learned to be suspicious of easy answers and miraculous cures, but it had also learned to value the steady, unglamorous work of healing that came through human knowledge and compassion. The shadows that had once plagued Charleston were gone, banished by the sacrifice of two young women who had chosen love over power, redemption over damnation. But the real victory was not in the dramatic confrontation with supernatural evil. It was in the quiet work of rebuilding that followed, the patient process of learning to trust in human goodness rather than seeking shortcuts through divine intervention. The horrific blessing that had come to the Whitcomb household was ended, but the lessons it taught would endure for generations. In a world where the line between faith and fanaticism could be dangerously thin, Charleston had learned to value the difference between genuine spirituality and the corruption that masqueraded as divine will. And in the mountains of North Carolina, a grieving father continued his work of ministry, carrying the memory of his daughters not as a burden of guilt, but as a reminder that the greatest miracles are often the ones we create ourselves through love, sacrifice, and the courage to do what is right, even when the cost is dear. The story of Clara and Miriam Whitcomb became a cautionary tale, whispered in theological seminaries and medical schools. A reminder that the human desire for transcendence could be both a blessing and a curse. But for those who knew them best, they were remembered not as cautionary figures, but as heroes who had chosen to save their community even at the cost of their own lives. In the end,